Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be back in your beautiful country for a second time, so thank you for having me. So by way of background, I'm a psychologist, a neuropsychologist, and I have the great privilege of working at UCL with people with young onset and rare forms of dementia. And when I came to Korea last time in 2017, we were in the middle of a residency, a 2-year residency, working in a museum called the Wellcome Collection in London, with the purpose of bringing together, where they have a space to bring together people who haven't worked together before. So this was a great opportunity in a museum setting to bring together people living with dementia and their friends and family supporting them, together with artists and scientists of many different types. And what I wanted to tell you a little bit about today is 2 aspects of our project. One of which is what we call people and perceptions, so looking at the artwork made by, with and for people living with dementia. And the other aspect, what we call in-the-moment experience, looking at how we can bring together qualitative and subjective measures, how people think and feel about what they're involved in, together with physiological, quantitative measures of how their body is responding. Our work, of course, wasn't the first to work in the area of dementia in the arts. We were working in a setting where there's lots of evidence, as we've been hearing, to show that arts engagement can help to improve people's mood and sense of well-being, the amount to which they feel connected to other people, and even that it might delay cognitive deterioration. There have also been a lot of large and well-conducted trials and studies looking at how involvement in the arts, particularly in people living with more advanced dementia, can help to reduce the amount of agitation that they experience, and also has an impact on the people living with them, both friends and family and professional carers, whose sense of well-being and achievement in their work can also increase as they develop relationships with the people they're working with. And even as recently as 2 weeks ago, the World Health Organization published this report on the role of the arts to improve health and well-being right across society. So that's the background, the big picture. For me, the personal story, my way into this area, was when you've seen these pictures already, and it was my great privilege to work with this gentleman, William Utemolen. He was diagnosed by my boss, Martin Grosser, with Alzheimer's disease in 1995. And I agree wholeheartedly with what was just said, that these images communicate very powerfully about the experience of living with Alzheimer's disease. But I would also argue that they also tell you something about the biology of the disease, because it is clear from these images that not just memory, but also the visual-perceptual and visual-spatial parts of the brain are clearly also being affected. Of course, very reasonably, people would ask, oh, well, didn't his artistic style just change? Maybe he meant to communicate in this way. But my argument would be that even when he wasn't trying to show this stylistic change, it was still evident, such as when we asked him on one of his visits to our laboratory to draw a man, and what he produced was very stylish, but when he'd finished drawing it, he said, no, there's something wrong here, but he couldn't see what was wrong. You've also heard already about the fact that there are many different types of dementia, and I would like to argue that art and the art made by people living with different types of dementia can be a powerful communicator about these conditions. So we've heard again that medics, people like me who work in a primarily medical facility, use things like brain scans and blood tests, and in my case as a psychologist, paper and pencil tests of skills like verbal memory and speech, calculation and object representation in order to try and profile these different dementias. So these little diagrams show which of these skills are lost and retained in different diseases. So for example, in typical memory-led Alzheimer's disease, it's verbal memory, non-verbal memory, which take a particular early hit. But it's vital that we also notice what isn't lost, what's spared. So, for example, in typical memory-led Alzheimer's disease, emotional processing, the emotional circuits of the brain, tend to be relatively unscathed, relatively preserved, till later in the disease. And it's this contrast between what's lost and what's spared that means so many people continue to be surprised when someone living with a dementia like Alzheimer's disease can't remember what they did yesterday, but can, for example, still get very excited when stimulated by a piece of art, or remember a song that they learnt as a teenager. Because all too often, dementia is treated as a diagnosis that means once someone has that diagnosis, people assume they can't do anything. They assume everything is lost, and it's just not true. And so I think the job in the arts sector and in many other areas of social and culture and society is to not just think, how can I change or adapt what I offer to suit someone who has lost certain skills, but also how can I adapt it to ensure it makes the most of the many skills they still preserve. And of course the other challenge is how can we view everybody as individuals. Each individual diagnosis will affect people differently, but clearly some diseases, like some forms of dementia, affect memory the most. Some affect the front of the brain and affect personality and behaviour and social change. Some affect the left side of the brain, leading to changes in language ability, whilst others affect the visual parts at the back of the brain. And of course these sorts of strengths and weaknesses aren't just reflected in medical tests, they're also apparent in the artwork that people produce. In this project, the artist Charles Harrison worked with people with all of these different types of dementia and presented people with the same blank canvases, the same paints, the same brushes, and the same objects to draw, and then left them to see how they would respond. And whilst it's easy to overinterpret, clearly this person with the visual form of dementia had a huge difficulty here painting the bottle being so transparent and difficult as a perceptual object. Whilst here the person with the behavioural change in the front of their brain was the one person who chose a very different tack, a much more eccentric approach to the opportunity, but nonetheless very powerful, very striking. Not only are there many different dementias, but of course the arts activities we are all involved in require a lot of different circuits in the brain. So this is a map of the different circuits required for understanding and enjoying different aspects of music, but you could equally draw a colour-coded map like this for the visual arts or for dance. So this map shows in blue the areas of the brain particularly important for remembering musical events, in green for basic music properties like tempo, in orange for scale and key, in red for recognising familiar music, and in yellow for the emotional elements of music. And so because each of the different dementias will hit different parts of the brain, some more than others, you can almost predict which elements of music in this case, but other art forms as well, people might struggle with or need a bit more support with. Before describing some specific arts projects, I just wanted to show you this absurdly complicated diagram and one which is a bit more sensible and understandable. So this one is just to show you, just for our simple project, the number of different people represented in circles and all these different professions: poetry, music, visual arts, social sciences, public health, computer science, the list goes on. And just to highlight, these are the inputs to our project, the stimuli if you like, and people's experiences and uncertainties and descriptions living with dementia were particularly key. But also the collection of the museum we were working in, the visual arts and the objects that they possessed. I don't know how many of you who work in a museum have ever thought that your artefacts might also be the stimulus for scientific inquiry. To try and break it down a little bit more simply, the way we tried to work was to ensure that all of our projects started with the experiences of people living with these conditions. The next thing we did was to try and create conversations of equality between people living with dementia, artists and scientists. We also found that place was really important. We didn't want these conversations to happen in a laboratory that suited the scientists, or just in a gallery or a studio that suited the artists, but in a place like a cultural institution that suited the people living with dementia. Now, of course, we were ambitious. We wanted the outputs of our project to be many and varied. We wanted there to be films and books and scientific reports and social gatherings and campaigns and blogs. And we were greedy. We wanted these things we were making to influence and be of benefit not only to other people living with dementia in recognising their experiences, but also to find the appropriate audience. So for a piece of art to be recognised as having an artistic audience, or for a scientific study to be viewed as a good piece of science. But what we were really pleased by was when the things that were coming out of these conversations were taken up by and used by people living with or caring for someone with dementia and used in a very different way. So for example, one of the films, which I'll show you in a moment, which was made by an animator to try and convey the experiences of people living with the visual form of dementia, was used in a hospital setting by a carer. So this lady's husband, who had this visual dementia, had broken his hip and was in hospital, but he was losing weight dramatically because the staff around him had never met anybody with this condition before, and they didn't know that he couldn't see where his food was or even if it was there. So in the midst of this busy ward, his wife, on her phone, showed the head nurse this short film, and she immediately showed it to all the other staff members on the ward, and suddenly they got it. Suddenly they understood how to care for him better. So a piece of art improved the quality of his health care. So I think for me that's another aspect of the dementia health conversation, is to constantly be ambitious about what a piece of art or involvement in a piece of art or reflections on a piece of art may bring. It may not just be an enjoyable visit to an institution, it may actually change someone's life. So I thought, just for a few minutes, I would just share with you a few of these projects, which people and perceptions projects, which we feel reflect or comment on the experiences and questions and uncertainties that people living with these different dementias have. So first, I thought it'd be good to just show a quick clip of this visual animation that I was talking about, in which the animator Simon Ball had tried to capture the experiences of people who perceive the world differently, not because their eyes are unwell, but because the brain cannot interpret the information coming in from the eyes.
I suddenly didn't know where to position my eyes in relation to the road.
It was raining and the light was going straight into your face and you just don't see it properly.
I zigzagged all the way, leaving tire marks.
Going over the pavement, hitting bollards or whatever.
I just thought, what's going on?
What if there'd been someone standing there instead of that bollard? I didn't know there was anything wrong.
Dementia? Why would you think it was dementia? How many million neurons involved in visual processing? Once certain neurons stop functioning as well as they would have done, virtually any combination of bits of your visual processing might go.
So the eyes are seeing it, but the brain is not recording it in a little slot back here.
It's an image that your brain's made up from what your eyes have captured. And so if it makes it up wrong, it's then persistent, which is not always true of people with normal Alzheimer's.
Just saying, how is the brain that's responsible for these visual problems, not the eyes?
An ordinary eye test won't necessarily show much. Because if you're looking at A, B, D, E, F, that's not a problem. But if you're trying to read a line,
I get the first word, and when I go on to the second word, the first word's gone.
Some from this sentence and some from this sentence, and then coming back up to this sentence.
Blobs on a piece of paper. Everything does dance around, all the letters, and eventually it just becomes one big blur.
I've read extensively all my life, and I can barely read.
I hope that gives you a little flavour. In that last section, people were just talking about the great difficulty they have with reading, where the words jump around or reverse or seem to move and be difficult to find on the page. Another artist worked in a completely different way. Charlie Murphy worked with a neuroscientist called Selina Ray, whose job is to take skin cells from people's arm and then transform them in a dish into brain cells. So these models, these so-called brains in a dish, help us to test the impact of genetic forms of dementia on cell growth and to test out treatments outside of the body. So Charlie was inspired by these images of the actual cells growing under the microscope and responded with these incredible glass sculptures and installations responding to and describing the growth of these cells. As a great example of public engagement, particularly for younger people, they also made a so-called Neuronal Disco, where they got people to dance and coordinate as if they were the brain cells growing together. But along with all that fun, and this very serious work also inspired the British science writer Philip Ball, who took part and grew his own brain cells in a dish, to write this fascinating book called How to Grow a Human. Just to shift gear again to something totally different, there is a famous type of cake in Britain called a Bakewell tart, because of a town called Bakewell in Derbyshire. And my colleague Emma, a social scientist, changed this and made a project called Bake-Tell tarts. So in this project, statements from interviews with people living with different types of dementia, we used this to inspire members of the public to reflect on what it might be like to live with that condition. And people, whether they had an experience of dementia or not, responded quite powerfully to these statements like, "I am very brave now," or "all we know is not yet." Another project led by the artist Charlie Harrison was a video installation project called Demeva, in which he responded to people with dementia being given a fairly standard test of reading ability. So you heard earlier on about the important role that cognitive tests of memory and language and so forth, hold in diagnosing dementia. But we also know it's one of the experiences which people with dementia hate the most. It makes them feel demeaned and belittled, as if you're pointing out everything they can't do. So in this moving project, the artist flipped things on its head and used the test that allowed people with different dementias to perform this test, which would usually be there to trip them up in the different aspects of reading, and actually allowed them to perform it to camera in a way that really revealed quite a lot about their personality. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about another aspect of the project, this in-the-moment work, where we tried to understand physiologically what was happening for people as they took part in different arts activities. So in dementia and arts work, frequently the impact of that work is recorded or measured or captured by asking people how they felt. But of course, we all, as humans, have physical reactions to our experiences, with our bodies, for example, becoming more aroused or elated in certain situations. So in our project, we tried out using some of these simple physiological measures in a variety of settings by asking people to wear wristbands, simple, lightweight wristbands that measured their heart rate and also the electrical activity on their skin, which is a marker of arousal. So in one project, we were the scientific collaborators on a TV documentary about a dementia choir of around 20 people living in Nottingham, led by the famous British actress called Vicky McClure. So in addition to raising awareness about dementia, because this programme was watched by about 2 or 3 million each time, we also measured people's well-being before and after every rehearsal, and also had them wear these watches. And what was interesting to us was that what people said about their experiences, the amount that they said that from before to after rehearsals that their well-being had increased, it wasn't just that they were saying it to please us. That increase correlated statistically significantly with the increase from before to during the rehearsal of their biological arousal levels. So too often people who are negative about arts and health work dismiss the evidence that you and I might put before them as anecdote or testimony. So I think when we try to bring together these different qualitative and quantitative methods, we can actually fight those arguments, those naysayers, and help them to realise that it's not just what people are saying, it's actually what their bodies are telling us. Another colleague, Janneke van Leeuwen, was very interested to know what happens when people with different forms of dementia look at visual works of art. So Janneke sat people in front of an eye-tracking camera, a very clever camera that looks and tells exactly where people are looking, and then showed works of art from the Wellcome Collection and a control set of images which were the same works distorted. What Janneke was really interested in is what is the difference between doing what often happens in galleries of giving people factual information about the painting when it was made, who made it, with what is called visual thinking strategies, a program which started at the MoMA Museum in New York. With visual thinking strategies, a facilitator doesn't just tell people about the art, they encourage them to think for themselves by asking them questions like, what's going on in this picture? What do you see that makes you say that? What more can we find? And what Janneke found is that when using this visual thinking strategy where you're thinking for yourself, people explored many more parts of the image than when they were just told what to think or told factual information. And this greater exploration was particularly pronounced for animate elements within the image, people, children, things that were happening, as opposed to static, inanimate objects. I think one other point to make is lots of the work in the Wellcome Collection is very dark and focused around death, and yet people still found it interesting. Too often people with dementia are patronised and only given opportunities that people think will make them happy. And actually, just like the rest of us, they're just as intrigued to think about challenging issues like death and suffering. One final little project I wanted to show you just to give an insight into a totally different type of measurement is thinking about how people move, how they physically respond to different arts opportunities. In this project, people were asked simply, with dementia, to paint a straight line on a canvas. But what's particularly revealing is not just what they produce, but how they produce it. In this video, I particularly loved the fact that this lady was so delighted that she did a little skip and a dance on her way, walking back away from the canvas. I've been working with people with dementia for 20 years, and I don't think any of my experiments have ever given anyone delight. This was an experiment designed by an artist, and he did it in his very first go. So just to wrap up, our residency was just for 2 years. It finished in summer 2018, but of course, like with all good conversations, they go on and on. So we hope in the future that there will be certainly lots more exhibitions, such as this work, this demonstration of these straight line paintings made by people with different forms of dementia at the Barbican just a couple of weekends ago. We of course also have a number of other experiments that continue to be ongoing, where we're asking hundreds of people to test out their physiological and subjective responses to different art forms. And it's a particular and enjoyable challenge for us to think, how can these different measures, these different ways of capturing and communicating people's experiences talk to one another? So for example, how can we tie together changes in heart rate and arousal with changes in pupil size when people see something that's emotionally stimulating, with things like just simply recording a video of people's faces and getting these clever computer algorithms to predict their emotional state. How can these tie together? We also think it's really important that we communicate more about the huge role that people living with different forms of dementia can play in the development of arts and research activities. It really mustn't be that we just think of people living with dementia as recipients or participants in the activities that we design, but that we recognise the contribution of people like William Tamona to actually inspire whole new areas of work. For us, for those of you who work in an institution, like a gallery or this wonderful MMCA here, I hope you also appreciate the impact that high quality space and environment and welcoming has on all of your visitors, because it certainly had a big impact on us. Thank you very much. Thanks,